Welcome to the Flavor Lab, a channel that's surprisingly not about different flavors of Labrador. Now, speaking of chocolate labs, today I want to make some of this, Nutella. Now, Nutella, if you've never had this before, is really amazing stuff. You can literally put it pretty much on anything. It goes well with fruit, goes with toast, on crepes, whatever you can think of. So the main ingredients in this stuff are chocolate and hazelnut. And recently I've been wondering, what other stuff can you put into it? Now, a couple years ago, the channel Chef Steps, one of the actual inspirations for me to start this channel, made a video where they were able to make a version of Nutella, but with pistachios. But I was kind of wondering, what happens if you use a non-nut ingredient? For example, what happens if you use banana? Can we make something that tastes any good? We'll see. Now, as usual, this is a total experiment, but I have a feeling this is probably gonna be good. We'll see, I could be wrong. Now, the recipe for actually making this is pretty simple, and the ingredients aren't too expensive to be able to get yourself. Now, the one thing that's kind of not standard is actually a portion of the method where I'm actually gonna be using a conch, which is basically a specialized tool for making chocolate. It's gonna really make a very, very smooth paste. However, I think that's kind of optional, and I think if you wanted to, you could make this at home with a food processor or a blender. You just might have a little bit more of a grainy texture than I ended up with here. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get started in making some butella. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we need to do is actually gather up all of our ingredients and then start measuring them out to be processed. I'm gonna start by combining all the dry ingredients together and then combine it with the fat, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, as far as the dry ingredients go, let's actually start with the largest ingredient by weight in Nutella, which is actually sugar. And so I'm gonna measure off 300 grams of granulated sugar. I think most other recipes call for a little bit more sugar, but since the bananas themselves are already quite sweet, I'm going to just kind of cut this back ever so slightly. All right, next we have our key star ingredient, which is our actual bananas. And so for this, I opted to use these kind of banana style chips that you can find at the grocery store. And the real reason is we don't really want a lot of moisture in this. So these banana chips work perfectly for that. And so for this recipe, I'm measuring off about 320 grams of our banana chips. Next, we have our powdered milk. Now this is also an ingredient in Nutella, and I think that it also will work well with our bananas. So I'm using about 130 grams of a kind of dry milk powder here. This is gonna really kind of round off the flavor and make it kind of more creamy in our mouths. Although it is optional, and you know, you could omit this if you don't really want to use milk here. Okay, now it's time to add the last of our dry ingredients, which is salt. Now I added about 14 grams here, but that might have been a tad too much. So maybe opt for about 10 grams of salt and you should be pretty good. As always, I'll have the recipe and the ingredient amounts in the description down below. Now that we have all of our dry ingredients together, we want to make a nice powder of this stuff. And it's going to help when we actually go to use this in the conch later. So to do this, all we need to do is actually just toss all of our ingredients into a food processor and give it a few pulses to kind of break it up a little bit, but just keep pulsing it, and then I just turned it on and let it go for a good minute. And during this time, all the components are just gonna break down and turn into almost like a wet sandy mixture, and that's exactly what we're going for here. And after I pull it out of the food processor, you can see this looks pretty good. So we're just gonna set this in a bowl off to the side, and we're gonna start working on our quote-unquote wet ingredients next. So now what it kind of really gives the backbone to that powder is what's known as a non-hydrodgenated vegetable oil, which basically means this is not a trans fat. However, when you really think about what this really is, it turns out to be palm oil. Now, palm oil is kind of ubiquitous in the world, and it's definitely not the healthiest stuff. You can kind of think about this as kind of the lard of the vegetable world. However, it is what's used in Nutella, and there's a reason for that. It's kind of solid at room temperature, and it's very spreadable, kind of like margarine or butter. And, you know, the reason for that is that backbone of palm oil. Now, I know there's a lot of ethical concerns around palm oil, and this stuff is supposedly not as. However, it is something to just kind of look into and be mindful of. But anyways, in order to actually be able to make this, we need to measure out about 250 grams of our palm oil. And what we're gonna do is we're going to melt this in a saucepan until it becomes liquid, and that should just take a few seconds. All right, so just keep heating this for a little bit until it entirely melts, and then we should be good. Now we have one last ingredient that we can add, which is known as Soy Lethicin. Now stuff is a very common emulsifier. It sounds like it's really crazy, but it's really not. This stuff is pretty much in everything. It really just kind of holds everything together, and we'll make sure that the oil doesn't separate out from the ingredients that we add into it. Now, this is optional and you can make it. It just might not hold up too long. So I'm adding about 10 grams of soy lecithin into the melted palm oil, and all right, that's that. Once this is done, we can actually move on to the step of actually putting this into the conch. So to do this, we need to set up the conch. Now, for those who've never seen this before, basically this is a weird metal contraption with a stone bottom, and it has these kind of stone rollers. And what happens is particles get trapped between the stone rollers and the bottom stone, and they just get crushed. And since this is rolling, this material just keeps getting crushed over and over and over again. And this basically results in a super fine texture. So we just put this thing together, and we start by adding the melted oil into the conch and just turn it on and off. And this really just allows everything to kind of get coated with that oil, and this just kind of lubricates everything. Once everything's kind of been running and everything seems nice and lubricated, it's time to start adding our dry ingredients. And to do this, we're just gonna add in, 1 spoon at a time, just add in some of that dry powder. Just keep doing this slowly, step by step, and just making sure that we don't form any clumps or anything like that. And then eventually what we'll notice is that really this stuff is gonna become really smooth, and we're gonna see that this really starts to look like a nice spreadable Nutella, honestly. It'll have that texture. Just keep adding it piece by piece until we're done. Okay, now there's one last thing we need to add, which is some vanilla. Now this is totally optional, but I have the perfect thing to add to it. Oh wait, these aren't ready yet. Okay, well, instead I'm gonna be just using some vanilla extract that I have laying around. I'm just gonna add a few drops of that to the conch and just let it go with this. And once this has all been added, we're just gonna leave this thing on and let it run. Now, I let mine run for about 3 hours, but you could let it honestly run for a lot longer. I think that the stuff I ended up with could even be smoother than what I had. However, it was still pretty good after about 3 hours. Now, quick note, if you're just gonna make this in a food processor, I would just add the melted palm oil directly into the food processor along with the dry ingredients, and just kind of let this go. As I said, I don't think you're gonna end up with a super fine texture, but it'll work. You can still put it on toast. After about 3 hours, I opened up my conch and it looked like this. And honestly, this looks really great. So let's just go ahead and pour this off into a ramekin, and we're done. All right, so I have the butella here that I've scooped out into a little ramekin, and it looks pretty awesome. I mean, honestly, it looks like Nutella. It's quite droopy, and it's very spreadable, and it's very smooth. Now, obviously the smoothness comes from the conch, and I just, letting this go in the conch for a while. Obviously, I realize a conch is not like a piece of equipment that most people have. They're quite expensive, and frankly, the only reason I have one is because you guys support me on this channel, and I was able to buy one from that. So let's see how this tastes. Yes, that is very good. It tastes, it really reminds me of like a banana pudding that you might get with Nilla wafers. Like where I grew up in the South, they had that at like almost all of the buffets. And like the Nilla wafers would get all soggy and soak into the banana pudding. Oh, it's, very much recommend making this, especially if you're a fan of bananas or like banana pudding. And I totally kind of want to just make some waffles now and spread this stuff all over it. The only thing I would say is that the version I have is maybe a little bit too salty. So I think I put about 12 or 14 grams of salt in it. I might cut that back a little bit by maybe, let's say, like probably 5 grams. But yeah, this stuff is delicious, and I highly recommend making it. All right, well, I think that's pretty much the best success that I could have imagined for. I'll let you guys know if this stuff turns brown or does anything crazy. Just look for like a thing down in the description. Maybe I'll put a little disclaimer that says, okay, it went bad after about a week. But other than that being said, I mean, there's no reason I don't think you guys can make this yourselves. It's really good. All right, with that being said, I think that's pretty much it for this week. And I hope to continue making weird stuff in the future. So if you have any cool ideas, please let me know. And one thing you could really do to support the channel is subscribe or share this video with other people. All right, well, anyways, thank you again, and see you guys later. Bye. Now, speaking of chocolate labs, today I want to kind of think about making,